Some legends go out with applause, others vanish in silence. He was the heartbeat of country comedy. Until one night in 1973, something inside his humble Tennessee cabin brought it all to a stop. Why did two quiet performers never return home? Why did police revisit the scene years later? And who knew what was really hidden behind those walls? This is a story where laughter met something much darker, and what came next changed everything. Before we start, feel free to share where you're watching from in the comments. It's always meaningful to see how far these stories travel. And hit subscribe if you'd like more powerful true stories like this. David Akeman wasn't born famous. Most people knew him as Stringbean, the lanky banjo-picking jokester from the TV show Hee Haw. He wore a long shirt, pants that stopped just below the knee, and a grin that made you feel like home. He wasn't flashy. He didn't chase headlines. But on stage, he was loved, especially by older fans who'd grown up with radio comedy, bluegrass, and a slower pace of life. But Stringbean never seemed to forget where he came from. He and his wife Estelle lived in a modest wooden cabin just outside Ridgetop, Tennessee. No fancy gates, no security alarms, just a winding driveway, a quiet front porch, and a few dogs that barked when visitors came too close. And yet, it's what happened in that very house, one quiet Saturday night in November 1973, that would leave Tennessee shaken for decades. That evening, Stringbean had played at the Grand Ole Opry, just like he had many times before. He arrived in the early evening, played his set, shook hands with a few regulars backstage, and left the building smiling. It was a routine night, the kind that blends in with 100 others, except this one wouldn't end the same. Estelle had gone with him. She always did. After the show, they stopped to chat, then made the 30-minute drive back home. The dogs barked as they pulled in. The porch light flickered. And sometime between walking through the front door and hanging up his banjo, something happened. They were never seen alive again. The next morning, a fellow Opry performer noticed Stringbean hadn't shown up for a hunting trip. That wasn't like him. He was quiet, but never rude. That small red flag would soon turn into a full-blown alarm. When friends arrived at the cabin the next morning, something felt off before they even stepped inside. One of the dogs was loose and pacing. The front door was slightly ajar, not kicked in, just wrong. It creaked when they pushed it open. What they found inside was not a burglary. It was a message. Stringbean was lying on the floor just inside the front room, shot. Estelle had tried to run. She didn't make it far. But here's what stuck with investigators. Nothing major seemed to be stolen. Not the banjo, not the TV, not even the car. Some cash was missing, yes, but the scene looked more like a warning than a robbery. And yet, it wasn't until they returned years later, after a tip from a fellow inmate, that police would find something buried behind the cabin wall. But we're not there yet. At first, detectives thought the motive was obvious: robbery. Stringbean had made good money from years of performing. He lived simply, but rumor had it he didn't trust banks. Folks around Nashville whispered that he kept cash hidden in the house. Police noticed drawers opened and contents scattered but not ransacked. His banjo, worth thousands, was untouched. Guns still hung on the wall. A small box of coins sat out in the open. Why would a thief leave those behind? Then they found Estelle, just outside the house behind the cabin. She had been chased and shot trying to escape. But again, her purse was still on her shoulder, jewelry still on her wrist. If someone came for valuables, they didn't take much. But if it was personal, who would target such a quiet couple? The next clue would come from a pair of muddy footprints near the back fence. News of the murders spread fast, not just in Nashville and across the entire country music world. Fans were heartbroken. Older folks who had watched Hee Haw for years were in disbelief. The idea that someone would hurt Stringbean, a man who played banjo and made people laugh, felt like something had broken in the world. But even more disturbing, Locals were nervous because they knew exactly what the rumors were. Everybody had heard that Stringbean kept large amounts of cash at home. He didn't trust banks. Some said he kept bills in his mattress. Others claimed it was under the floorboards. So was this just a thief who took it too far? Or did someone know him? Someone who had been inside the house before? Police began asking around quietly. One name came up more than once. Not a stranger, not a fan. It was someone younger and familiar. The name John Brown wasn't new to law enforcement. He was a 23-year-old local who had done time for petty theft and armed robbery. But what made the hairs stand up on the back of an officer's neck? Brown's brother, Doug, had once worked with Stringbean. Doug had painted the cabin years earlier. He'd been inside. When detectives pulled his file, they saw something chilling, a recent release, known to carry a .22 caliber, the same type used in the murders. And more than that, he'd been asking around about where Stringbean kept his money. The brothers weren't hard to find. They were living together, not far from the crime scene. Police brought them in quietly. No arrest, just a few questions. But something in John's voice cracked when they mentioned the cabin. He started to sweat. Then, without prompting, he asked, "Did you find the wall yet?" It was a strange thing to say. "Did you find the wall yet?" He hadn't been told anything about a wall. Investigators knew immediately. He'd been there. Now the pressure was on. In questioning, John Brown claimed he was just repeating something he heard, but police weren't buying it. He'd mentioned a wall. No one had said anything about a wall. The public didn't know anything about one. The brothers were released for the moment, but the house was being watched. Meanwhile, police returned to the cabin, looking at it differently now. What if Stringbean had hidden more than just cash? What if there really was something inside the walls? They searched again. Attic, closets, under floorboards. Nothing obvious. But in the back bedroom, near an old hand-built shelf, they noticed a faint draft along the wooden seam. Behind it, the paneling didn't match the rest of the room. They pried open the wall carefully, not with a crowbar but slowly, with gloved hands and small tools. The wood groaned. It wasn't built for storage. It was built to hide. Behind the panel was a shallow space just large enough to store a few things. And inside, bundles of cash, still wrapped in paper bands. Some were old, faded. Others were crisp. Tens of thousands of dollars. Untouched. Unreported. It confirmed two things. One, Stringbean had been hiding money at home just as the rumors said. Two, the killers never found it. Police believed the Browns had come for this exact stash and never found it, even after killing two people. But now they had a new question. If the killers didn't get the money, what exactly did they take? The answer would explain everything and lead to a second, almost forgotten clue near the cabin woods. Just beyond the edge of the cabin's yard, near the back fence, a deputy had spotted something earlier that morning. A partial boot print pressed into a patch of frozen dirt. At the time, it didn't seem significant. But now, knowing what lay hidden in the wall, it seemed more important. It was a heavy step, like someone had paused or turned suddenly. The print matched the tread of a common work boot, size 11. It wasn't unusual, but it gave officers a direction. The impression pointed toward the woods, not the road. Had one of the killers waited outside while the other went in? Or had someone circled back later, maybe even after the crime? Deputies followed the fence line deeper into the trees and spotted something they'd missed before, a crumpled piece of cloth snagged on the barbed wire. It wasn't a leaf or garbage. It looked like a glove. The glove was old but intact. Inside was something even more valuable, a single hair, dark and wiry, caught in the inner lining. Back at the station, detectives kept digging. The Browns still hadn't been arrested, but their names were now in every conversation. Investigators checked their criminal history and realized both brothers had previous charges, including one involving breaking and entering with a firearm. Still, they didn't have enough to charge them, yet. But John Brown made a mistake. 2 days later, a tip came from a pawn shop a few towns over. A man had brought in a vintage watch, engraved with the initials D.A. The owner remembered it because the man seemed nervous and rushed. The name on the pawn ticket? Doug Brown. Now, police had more than suspicion. They had a link between the stolen item and the man who once worked inside that very cabin. It didn't take long after that. Doug and John Brown were arrested on charges of armed robbery and double homicide. The stolen watch, confirmed by surviving family of Stringbeans, was all the court needed to issue a warrant. At first, both men denied everything. Doug stayed mostly quiet, arms crossed. John, the younger one, seemed to teeter between bravado and fear. But it was Doug who finally cracked. Faced with mounting evidence, including the glove, the bootprint direction, and the pawned watch, he admitted to breaking into the cabin. What he said next made investigators pause. He claimed they hadn't expected the couple to return so soon. "We thought they'd be at the Opry all night," he said, "but they came back too fast." And then he added one more thing, something that brought a sudden chill to the room. "We never found the wall," he muttered. Doug Brown's full confession laid it out. They had planned it for weeks. He knew the layout of the cabin from when he'd painted it years earlier. He'd told John about the rumors of cash hidden somewhere inside, cash no bank had ever seen. They drove up that night thinking the cabin would be empty, but Stringbean and Estelle got home early. According to Doug, Stringbean walked in first and startled John. A shout, then a shot. Estelle screamed. She ran outside into the cold. Doug said he had tried to stop John, but it was too late. The story was ugly, but consistent with the crime scene. Still, something felt missing. If they hadn't found the wall stash, where had they searched? What exactly had they taken? Doug never said. And one detective remembered. Not all the drawers were open. Just one. The old wooden chest near the fireplace. That chest was plain, worn, easy to overlook. But when investigators went back, this time with permission from Stringbean's family, they opened it carefully. Inside were some old clothes, a pair of suspenders, a cracked radio, and beneath those, a faded envelope, yellowed at the edges, sealed shut. It had Stringbean's name on the front, handwritten. Inside they found a note, folded neatly. It wasn't dramatic, just a few sentences. It read, "If anything happens, the rest is behind the wall. Tell Estelle's brother. He'll know." The handwriting was confirmed as Stringbean's, a quiet man, but careful. He must have known the rumors would spread. He'd tried to keep her safe even in death. But why hadn't anyone known about the note sooner? Had someone else found this before and put it back? Detectives couldn't prove it. But someone, they believed, had gone through the chest before the police ever arrived. The letter confirmed one thing. Stringbean had been hiding money, and he didn't fully trust anyone, not banks, and maybe not even local law enforcement. But the fact that the letter hadn't been found until now raised a troubling question. Was the cabin truly undisturbed before police arrived, or had someone entered after the murders, but before the first official search? There were no signs of forced entry after the fact. No broken windows, no new tracks in the dirt. But one neighbor claimed she saw a dark pickup truck parked down the road early the next morning, well before news of the killings broke. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. Had someone come back for something? Or to check if the money was found? There was no proof, no license plate, no witness who saw the driver. But it wouldn't be the last time someone returned to that cabin. With Doug and John Brown behind bars, many believed the case was finally over. The courtroom was packed during sentencing. The brothers were convicted of first-degree murder, robbery, and conspiracy, and both received life in prison. But justice didn't feel like closure. Estelle's family rarely spoke publicly, but one relative told a reporter, "They died scared. That's what I can't stop thinking about." The cabin was eventually boarded up. Some locals said they could still hear the dogs barking when they passed by. For a while, that was the end of it. But around 1996, over 2 decades later, a new set of owners bought the land where the cabin stood. They planned to restore it, maybe even live there. During cleanup, they began removing rot and termite-damaged paneling from one of the back walls, and that's when they discovered a small, rusted metal box wedged deep behind a beam. The box wasn't easy to reach. It was pushed far back between two supporting beams in a wall that had never been part of the original police search. No one had known it existed. It was sealed tight, wrapped in an old cloth that had mostly rotted away. Inside were rolled dollar bills, faded bank ledgers, and several personal items: a pocket knife, a locket with Estelle's initials, and a folded receipt from a gas station dated 2 days before the murder. But that wasn't all. At the very bottom of the box, tucked beneath the papers, was a photograph, torn on one side. It showed Stringbean and Estelle standing on the porch, but next to them was someone else. The face was unclear, faded, almost washed out. But what stood out was the outline of a jacket, the same kind a witness once described seeing on the man outside the cabin. Investigators reviewed the photo but couldn't enhance it enough to clearly identify the third person. Facial features were too blurred. Still, the clothing, posture, and presence raised questions. Why had Stringbean kept that photo hidden? Was it just a memento or a warning? Records confirmed the receipt in the box matched a transaction made just before the couple's final show, meaning this box had likely been placed there only hours before their deaths. But something else stood out now. The man in the photo wasn't either of the Brown brothers. He looked older, broader, and his jacket? Not a local brand. One deputy noticed a patch that looked military. This started a new theory, that someone else may have been involved. Someone watching from outside while the Brown brothers committed the murders inside. But without clear ID, the lead went cold. Until someone called from a prison in Alabama. The call came from a man named Clarence Hensley, an inmate serving time for unrelated charges. He claimed he'd shared a cell with Doug Brown in the early 1980s, years after the murder. Clarence said Doug used to talk in his sleep about a man named Red, a man who watched the porch the night of the killings. Doug never named him in daylight, but according to Clarence, he once muttered, "Red never got what he came for. We should have gone back." Police had no Red listed on record, but when they pulled old employment files, they found something odd. The cabin had once been worked on by a contractor named Marvin Red Pollard, a former Army mechanic who lived 2 counties over. He died in the late 80s. But what caught their attention? Pollard had been arrested for armed robbery in 1972, just a year before the Stringbean murders. Marvin Red Pollard had slipped through the cracks. He died of heart failure in 1988, long before DNA evidence became a routine part of cold cases. His name had never appeared during the original Stringbean investigation. But his connection to the Browns now raised questions. Pollard had served time at the same low-security prison as Doug Brown, released just months before the murders. Even more, records showed that Pollard had done handyman work at cabins around Ridgetop, including one owned by a neighbor of Stringbean's, and in that gas station receipt found in the hidden box, a second purchase was listed, a can of motor oil under a different name. The signature? Monsieur Pollard. Had he driven the getaway car? Or stood watch while the Browns went inside? Police would never get to ask him. But what they found next, buried behind the barn, brought his name right back into focus. The new property owners hadn't planned on disturbing the barn, but a portion of the floor was beginning to sink, likely due to water damage. While pulling up the old boards, they hit something metallic, large, round, rusted. It was an oil drum, half buried in red Tennessee clay. At first, they thought it was just garbage. But when they pried it open, the smell was sharp. Old gasoline, rotted paper, mildew. Inside were fragments of cloth, a torn duffel bag, and wrapped bundles of letters and receipts, too damaged to read. What stood out was a military-style canvas jacket, partially preserved by the dry center of the drum. It was marked with a faint name tag, M. Pollard. Investigators examined it carefully. Inside one pocket, barely intact, was a torn photograph corner, the exact match to the missing edge from the photo found behind Stringbean's wall. It wasn't coincidence. The photo fragment fit like a puzzle piece. When placed beside the original, it completed the image. Stringbean and Estelle smiling on the porch, and Marvin Red Pollard standing next to them, just off-center. This confirmed something chilling. Red hadn't just been near the property. He'd known them. He'd been there before. And if that picture was taken just days before the murder, it raised a possibility few wanted to say out loud. Had the couple trusted him? The timeline now painted a haunting picture. Two men break in, a third watches from outside, maybe even pretending to be a friend, standing guard. And when the plan went wrong, they left in a panic, without ever finding the hidden wall. Still, investigators weren't sure why Pollard's items were hidden in the barn. But one old man in town remembered why that barn was familiar to Pollard in the first place. The barn had once been more than storage. According to neighbors, it had served as a makeshift workshop. Stringbean, always practical, had let locals use it to repair tools or store equipment. Pollard had been there often, tuning engines, changing oil, even rebuilding a lawnmower for the Akemans. He knew the barn better than anyone. And now it seemed clear. After the murders, he had returned, possibly alone, possibly to retrieve something they had missed. Had he buried the jacket and letters to protect himself, or as a backup plan in case the Browns ever turned on him? No one knew for sure. But the final clue came not from evidence, but from a faded receipt found among the barn items. It was dated November 8, 1973, 2 days after the murders, and it listed one thing: .22 caliber pistol, pawned. That receipt raised eyebrows fast. It didn't name the buyer, but it confirmed the weapon, a .22 caliber pistol, and the timing, just 2 days after Stringbean and Estelle were murdered. Investigators pulled records from every pawn shop within 100 miles. Most had burned or digitized their old logs, but one still had carbon copies in storage. There they found the match. The pistol had been sold to a collector 5 years later, then resold, and eventually reported as stolen in a burglary. The weapon was never recovered, but the handwriting on the original pawn ticket matched Pollard's job application from 1971, nearly identical loops, pressure, and slant. That didn't make him the trigger man, but it confirmed what the letter in the hidden wall had suggested. Someone else knew where the money was, someone who never faced trial, and someone who may have watched it all from the shadows. Even with Pollard's name now tied to the cabin, the photo, and the weapon, he was never formally charged. He'd died nearly a decade before the Browns were even convicted. There was no confession, no living witness willing to testify against him. The Browns, when questioned later, denied Pollard's involvement. Doug Brown said they acted alone, but one retired officer believed differently. He noted something odd from the original crime scene: a second set of boot prints behind the cabin, larger, wider spaced, as if someone was watching from the tree line. Back then they had assumed the prints were left by first responders. But now, looking at photos, they clearly predated the arrival of police. So who stood back there in the dark, saying nothing, watching as a man and woman were shot? The evidence couldn't answer that, but the missing gun and the buried box strongly hinted that someone had returned. The box inside the wall, first found by police and later revisited by the family, had been sealed tightly. Yet something about it still didn't sit right. It was a small space, barely deep enough to fit the bundles of cash, but one corner seemed oddly shaped, almost as if another panel had once covered something else. A contractor working on the cabin restoration decided to take a closer look. Gently removing part of the wall frame, he discovered a shallow crevice behind the support beam. Tucked inside was a single, sealed envelope. The handwriting was faded, but the name on the outside read simply, Estelle. It was addressed in Stringbean's handwriting. When opened, it revealed only a short note. If you find this before I do, stay at your sister's tonight. I'll bring the money tomorrow. The date? November 9th, 1973. The night they were murdered. That one sentence changed everything. If the note was genuine, and all signs suggested it was, then Stringbean hadn't planned to bring Estelle home that night. He'd expected her to stay elsewhere, but she hadn't. She'd come home with him, as always. Did she change her mind at the last minute? Or had she never seen the letter at all? Some believed Stringbean knew something that day, that he'd felt uneasy. Maybe he'd heard rumors, maybe someone had warned him. Others thought he'd simply grown more cautious, and the letter was just routine. But what unsettled the family most was this. If Estelle had seen the note, she likely would have lived. And if the Browns knew he'd planned to move the money, it meant they may have acted faster than planned. A robbery rushed. A plan gone wrong. But there was still one place that hadn't been searched. Not properly. The cabin didn't have a traditional basement, but there was a small crawl space beneath the floorboards, originally used to store tools and protect against frost in winter. It was dark, cramped, and always damp. Never considered important during the original investigation, but during the recent restoration, a contractor discovered a sealed box tucked behind an old heating pipe. It was wrapped in layers of wax cloth, likely to protect it from moisture. Inside were two things: a leather-bound address book and a small revolver, rusted but intact. The address book had a list of names. Most were family and friends, but one stood out: red backup route, followed by a crude hand-drawn map. The line curved around the cabin and ended at the tree line, the same area where the mysterious second boot prints were found. It seemed Stringbean had expected trouble, but why hadn't he warned anyone? The map wasn't professionally drawn, just pencil on faded paper, folded carefully in the back of the notebook. But when overlaid on the original property layout, it matched perfectly. The backup route traced a path around the cabin, through a patch of trees, and toward the rear fence. Exactly where the boot prints had been seen, and where the glove had been found. Who was red to him? A friend? A threat? A contingency? If Stringbean had drawn the map himself, and it seemed he had, then he may have been planning to relocate the cache, maybe even confront someone. But he never got the chance. And if Red was watching from those trees, what was he waiting for? A signal? A sound? Or had he lost his nerve? The final items recovered from the crawlspace, a small dog whistle and a half-filled thermos, offered no answers. But something about them felt deliberate. The thermos was old but still sealed. When opened, it smelled faintly of coffee, sour, rusted, untouched for decades. But the presence of the dog whistle beside it struck a strange chord. Estelle and Stringbean were known for their love of dogs. They had several, all well-trained. A whistle on the property wasn't unusual, but tucked away in a crawl space next to a hand-drawn escape route, that was different. Had Stringbean planned to use it as a signal? Was it meant for Estelle or someone else? A local historian later confirmed that the kind of whistle found was military issue, common in Vietnam-era field kits, especially among forward scouts. Pollard had served overseas. If the whistle belonged to him, then maybe this space wasn't built as an escape route, but as a hiding place, where someone could wait, listen, and watch. The question now, had anyone actually waited down there? Investigators revisiting the crawl space weren't looking for anything new, but one technician noticed something subtle, a dust pattern smudged in the corner, unlike the rest of the area. Everything was coated in decades-old dirt and cobwebs, except a narrow line, like something long and flat had once rested there. Measurements matched the size of a rifle or shotgun. That discovery raised a troubling possibility that someone had once sat under that house, weapon ready, waiting for the moment to act, or never needing to. Had this space been used before the murders, or after? If Pollard had circled back and stashed gear beneath the cabin, it suggested He wasn't just a lookout. He may have been planning to return later, maybe even use the spot again. But for what? Whatever his plan had been, he died without revealing it. And the Browns never spoke of the crawlspace, not even once. After their convictions, Doug and John Brown spent decades behind bars. Neither man ever gave a full confession. Doug admitted to the robbery, John admitted to firing the shots. But both denied there was a third man involved. Every time Marvin Red Pollard's name came up, they shut down. Was it out of fear, loyalty, or were they just covering a mistake that went further than they'd planned? In 2003, a retired prison guard claimed Doug once whispered, "Red brought the map. We just didn't find the right wall." That statement, though hearsay, matched too many other details to ignore. Still, no charges were ever filed posthumously. The system had its convictions. The case was officially closed. But one investigator, long retired, kept the map, the photo, and the note. And in 2018, he gave them to someone who had never stopped wondering, someone with a personal reason to search deeper. The man's name was Calvin Harmon, Estelle's nephew. He'd been just a teenager when his aunt and uncle were killed. Now in his late 60s, he still visited the site once a year to walk the grounds, talk to locals, and sit for a while near what remained of the porch. When the retired detective handed him the documents, he didn't expect much. But that note addressed to Estelle, the one that said, "Tell Estelle's brother, he'll know," hit him differently now. Because Estelle's brother had passed away years earlier, and Calvin had inherited his things, including an old envelope Estelle had once mailed him, never opened, postmarked the day before the murders. He hadn't known it existed. It was tucked in a family Bible. Inside the envelope, a single photo, Estelle, Stringbean, and a handwritten caption, "Red says we're being watched." Probably just squirrels. But maybe it wasn't. That one sentence, "Red says we're being watched," took everything from speculation to something closer to certainty. The caption wasn't a warning. It was a joke, a casual remark scribbled without fear, which meant, at least at the time the photo was taken, Red wasn't seen as a threat. But knowing what happened later, it changed everything. Calvin brought the photo to the local museum where the original shot had been scanned years earlier. When they compared the two versions, the original and the restored corner from the crawlspace, one detail stood out. Red's hand was resting on the porch rail, but in the recovered corner you could now see his fingers gripping something just out of frame, round, metallic. Zoomed in, it looked like a small key. Calvin never did find out what that key belonged to, but to this day the cabin shed remains padlocked shut. The shed behind the cabin had always been there, a squat, rust-colored structure leaning slightly to one side. Over the years, it had been used to store tools, firewood, and gardening supplies, but during every investigation, every visit, it was overlooked. Not locked because it was suspicious, but because it was ordinary. The padlock was rusted shut, the door warped from years of weather. Calvin had assumed it was empty. But the photo, with Red holding what looked like a small key, brought new meaning to that locked door. He returned days later with a locksmith. When the door finally creaked open, the air inside was dry and still. No strong smell, no obvious signs of life, just a workbench, a few rusted toolboxes, and a shelf full of oil cans. But behind one of the shelves, loose against the back wall, was a thin wooden panel, slightly ajar. The shelf looked like it had been nailed to the wall. But when Calvin tugged gently at the edge, it shifted. One hinge creaked. Then, with a bit more pressure, the entire unit swung out like a hidden door. Behind it was a small alcove, about the size of a suitcase. Inside was a wooden crate. No markings, no labels, just a rusted latch and a split down the side. Calvin hesitated. Was this really something? Or just an old stash left behind? He pried the crate open and found a rolled cloth bag, heavy with the sound of metal shifting inside. Within it were dozens of small items, coins, receipts, empty envelopes, and one wallet. When he opened the wallet, the ID card inside said, David Akeman. It was Stringbean's, but his real wallet had already been logged into evidence decades earlier. So whose version was this, and why was it hidden? The ID inside the wallet looked identical to the one on file. Same address, same photo, same handwriting. But something felt off. The material was thinner. The ink faded unevenly. A closer inspection revealed what experts later confirmed. It was a forgery. And inside were other items. Library cards, a checkbook, all in Stringbean's name, but none ever recorded or used. So who made this? And for what purpose? Only one plausible explanation emerged. Someone had intended to assume his identity, at least temporarily. But why? Perhaps to withdraw funds, to intercept mail, or maybe to frame the timeline? The checkbook contained no carbon copies, but there was one stub, handwritten and faded. November 11, RR. Final payout. The initials RR didn't match anyone involved in the case, but they matched the contractor's registry for Ridgetop Repair, owned by Red Pollard's cousin. Another door had quietly opened. RR had never come up before. But when investigators dug into old business records, they confirmed that Ridgetop Repair had operated from 1972 to 1974, then quietly dissolved just months after the murders. Red Pollard's cousin, Raymond Pollard, was listed as owner. He had no criminal record, no known connection to the Browns. But according to a 1973 tax filing, the business had reported a one-time cash deposit of $9,200, equivalent to over $60,000 today. That money was deposited 2 weeks after Stringbean's death. Raymond passed away in 1992. He was never questioned, never mentioned in the investigation. But here he was, the silent fourth name, in a case that officially only ever had 2 suspects, with no living witnesses, no further evidence, and no way to confirm where that money came from. The case hit a quiet wall again, until Calvin found one more thing, tucked in the floorboards. It was just paper, curled and brown at the edges, lodged deep in a crack under the floor near the shed's threshold. Most would have missed it, but Calvin pulled it free and unfolded what appeared to be the final page of a notebook. It was written in Stringbean's voice. You could tell by the phrasing. A man not used to long letters, just short notes, clean, direct. If they come, I'll walk her out front. Let them think it's normal. Keep eyes off the shed. Red can handle the rest. If I don't come back in, check the map. That single paragraph revealed more than years of files. Stringbean hadn't just been cautious, he knew something was coming. And he had a plan, one that didn't go as expected. But there was one phrase that stood out above all else. Red can handle the rest. Had he trusted the wrong man? The last page in Stringbean's handwriting reshaped everything. It confirmed he suspected danger and had placed his trust in someone named Red. He'd hoped to walk Estelle out front, make it seem routine, let her pass unnoticed. But that plan never happened. They both came home. They both went inside. The Browns had entered too soon. And Red? If he was meant to handle the rest, then he had either failed or chosen not to. Which leaves one haunting possibility. Red was never part of the plan. He was a risk Stringbean underestimated, or a threat he misread as loyalty. Calvin folded the note and placed it beside the old photo. He didn't try to solve what couldn't be solved, but he understood more now. About the silence, the planning, and the reason investigators kept returning. Because one detail remained unexplained. No one ever found the key Red was holding. The cabin no longer stands. What was left of it was taken down in 2020 after the structure became too unstable. The land remains fenced but open, a quiet field surrounded by trees that still remember. People still stop by, mostly locals, some fans. A few family members who lived through the headlines. And once a year, Calvin returns with a small photo and leaves it on a wooden marker near where the porch once stood. It's not marked with names, no plaque. Just a smooth stone and a folded page. He doesn't talk much about what he found in the shed, but he keeps the map, and the dog whistle, and the note. Because for him, it was never about solving everything. It was about making sure the story didn't disappear. Because long after the applause fades, some people vanish quietly, and some stories are never quite finished. Some mysteries leave behind headlines, others leave behind silence. Stringbean's story was never about how famous he was, but how carefully he tried to live and how little that protected him. He trusted too deeply, planned too late. And what followed became one of country music's quietest tragedies. 3 names were exposed, 1 still lingers, and somewhere the truth may still be hidden behind a key that no one ever found. The Stringbean murder case remains one of country music's most haunting true crime stories. While the Stringbean Akeman murder investigation officially closed with the Brown brothers' convictions, the 1973 country music tragedy continues to captivate those fascinated by unsolved celebrity murders and famous country music murders. What happened to Stringbean that November night reveals how even beloved Grand Ole Opry performers weren't safe from violence. The Stringbean cabin discovery of hidden cash and mysterious connections to Red Pollard suggests this Nashville murder history case may never be fully resolved. For fans of true crime documentaries and country music history tragedies, the Stringbean and Estelle Akeman murder serves as a stark reminder that behind the laughter and music lay real-life murder mysteries that still echo through Appalachian true crime stories today. Some secrets, like that missing key, remain buried forever.